When we say the West, what usually comes to mind? Probably a place on a map, right? North America, Western Europe. But what if the West isn't really a place at all? What if it's actually a powerful idea, a kind of historical invention that has completely shaped how we see the world and even how we see ourselves? Okay, let's really get into this. So, what is the West? And where is it? It sounds like a simple question, but people have been wrestling with it, believe it or not, since the time of Columbus. I mean, he sailed west trying to get to the east and was convinced he'd made it. And today, that same puzzle is still with us. We talk about Western values, Western culture, but what are we actually talking about?
Because if you try to just use a map, things get weird, fast. Take Japan. Geographically, it's about as far east as you can get. But technologically, economically, it's considered totally Western. And then you have Latin America, which is literally in the Western Hemisphere, but for decades it's been seen as part of the developing world, trying to catch up to the West. So, yeah, just looking at a map, it doesn't really work, does it?
And that brings us to the real heart of the matter. The West isn't a geographical location. It's a historical idea, a construct. It's basically a shorthand to describe a certain type of society, one that's developed, industrialized, urbanized, capitalist, and modern. It first popped up in Western Europe, sure, but now any society that fits that description can be called Western, no matter where on the globe it sits. And this idea, it's not just a simple label. It actually does things. It works in four really important ways. First, it just neatly chops the world into two boxes, Western and non-Western. Then it paints a picture for each one, usually using stereotypes. Third, it sets the West up as the yardstick, the gold standard that everyone else is measured against. And finally, and this is the big one, it turns into an ideology where developed means good and desirable and underdeveloped means, well, not so good. And that right there, that's where this idea gets its real power. It's not just describing the world, it's judging it.
All right, so if this is such a big, powerful idea, where in the world did it come from? Well, to figure that out, we've got to jump in our time machine and go way back to the moment Europe first started to really encounter other parts of the world.
Think back to the 15th and 16th centuries. This was when Europe just exploded onto the world scene. It started with Portugal feeling its way down the coast of Africa. Then it got a massive jolt from Columbus bumping into the Americas. And pretty soon, you have ships circling the entire planet. For the very first time, all these different worlds were being pulled into one global system, with Europe sitting right at the center. And this quote, man, it just perfectly captures the mindset at the time. In 1494, Spain and Portugal sat down and literally drew a line on a map, dividing the entire non-European world between them. I mean, can you imagine the audacity? They hadn't even been everywhere yet. It was this huge psychological shift that basically said, we're at the center of everything, and the rest of the world is ours for the taking. Okay, but how does a way of thinking like that become, well, normal? How does it get so baked into the culture that nobody even questions it? The answer is something called discourse. It's all about the power of language. Now, discourse might sound a little academic, but it's a pretty straightforward idea. It's not just about talking. It's the whole framework, the language, the concepts, the images that we use to make sense of a topic. And here's the kicker. This knowledge it creates isn't neutral. It shapes how we think and what we do. And when a discourse gets powerful enough, it creates what's called a regime of truth. It makes one version of reality seem like the only reality, like it's just common sense. And let's be crystal clear about this. The discourse of the West and the rest was never, ever innocent. It was all about power. Europeans didn't show up with a blank slate, right? They came with their own ideas and tried to cram everything they saw into their own little boxes. They were looking for specific things: gold, land, converts. The conquistador Cortés famously said, "We Spaniards suffer from a disease that only gold can cure." And on top of all that, it was a collision between worlds that had wildly unequal power. So to really get the logic behind this, let's think about something super simple, like night and day. How do we know what night is? Well, mostly we know it's not day. We understand it through its opposite. So much of our meaning comes from these kinds of simple, binary oppositions. And this is exactly what the West did for its own identity. It figured out what it was by figuring out what it wasn't. The West was civilized because the rest was uncivilized. The West was rational because the rest was irrational or superstitious. The West was developed because the rest was undeveloped. Each side of that pair gets its meaning from the other. So This whole process of defining yourself by what you're not, it gives rise to this powerful and pretty simplistic figure, the other. And the way this other was created and managed involved some specific strategies.
The number one tool in the toolbox was stereotyping. This is where you take millions of people, entire complex societies, and you just squash them all down into one flat, simple, exaggerated image. It's like a caricature. And that single image then gets treated as the absolute, unchanging truth about that entire group of people.
But it gets even more clever, or, more insidious. The discourse often uses a strategy called splitting. First, you create that one-dimensional stereotype. Then, you split it right down the middle into a good half and a bad half. They seem like complete opposites, but they're really just two sides of the same invented coin.
And this leads us to maybe the most famous split stereotype of all time, the savage. On one side, you have the noble savage. Oh, he's so innocent, pure, living in harmony with nature in some kind of paradise. This was basically Europe's fantasy of escaping its own problems. But then on the other side, you have the ignoble savage, a violent, barbaric, depraved cannibal. And this was the justification for conquering them. Both were complete fantasies, projected onto real people.
Okay, so you might be thinking, this is all interesting history, but why does it matter now? Well, this way of thinking didn't just fade away. It had massive consequences, and it became a fundamental part of how the West understood the whole idea of history and progress. Take this famous line from the philosopher John Locke. He wasn't just being poetic. What he meant was that the Americas represented what Europe used to be like in its own distant past. It was like a living museum of humanity's childhood. And this idea puts every single society on one single ladder of development, with the savage way down at the bottom and, you guessed it, modern Europe standing proudly at the top. And these ideas, they didn't just stay in philosophy. They burrowed deep into the foundations of how we study society, into sociology itself. You look at Karl Marx, and he talked about an Asiatic mode of production, basically a vision of the East as being stuck, stagnant, until the dynamic West came along to shake things up. Or Max Weber, who tried to explain why capitalism only took off in the West. His answer? The East just didn't have the right rational ingredients. In both, you can totally see the ghost of that old West versus the rest binary.
All right, so let's wrap this all up. What's the big takeaway here? First, the West is an idea, a really powerful one, not just a dot on a map. Second, that idea was built by creating an opposite, the rest. Third, it works through a whole system of stereotypes and simple opposites, like civilized versus uncivilized. And finally, this way of thinking wasn't just some historical curiosity. It literally helped build Western identity and even laid the foundation for how we've studied global development for centuries.
So if we can see how this one big idea, the West and the rest, shaped centuries of our past, it forces us to ask a really important question about our world right now. What are the big, powerful, maybe even invisible ideas and discourses that are shaping our present?